You are watching someone being pulled out of the emperor's private chambers. They are not walking. Two palace attendants drag the body by the arms. Marble scrapes beneath heels that no longer try to stand. Torchlight ripples across polished stone, and for a moment, the hallway looks like water. The eyes are open, fixed. Whatever used to live behind them is gone. 3 days ago, this person laughed in the room next to yours. This morning, a name was called. Now, the space where a person should be feels hollowed out, like a house after a fire, walls still standing, everything else ash. An attendant notices you staring. Fingers clamp around your wrist, sharp, urgent. You're pulled backward, door shut, latch dropped. "Don't look," she whispers. "Never look. And when they come for you, don't resist." This is Rome. The year is 39 AD. You have been confined inside a secluded imperial complex known as the Garden of Venus for days now, and you have just learned the rule that governs everything here. When someone is summoned, they do not return the same. You were told this was an honor. Families said it was a privilege to be noticed by the palace. Neighbors watched the carriage climb the hill with envy. No one explained what the gates swallowed. No one described the waiting, or the silence, or the way footsteps at night feel heavier than chains. No one told you that the most powerful man on earth had built a system, documented, audited, and enforced, that reduced human beings to entries on wax tablets, names, descriptions, notes, movements, summons, and outcomes. This is the story of what Caligula built inside his palace. But the most disturbing part isn't the cruelty. It's that it worked. It worked because no one stopped it. Not the Senate, not the guards, not the officials who stamped the seals, not even the families who stood at the doors and convinced themselves this was an honor. Everyone knew. Everyone stayed quiet. Before you can understand how such a place existed, you need to understand how a human being becomes capable of designing it, because Caligula wasn't born a monster. He was manufactured. Years earlier, a child ran through a Roman military camp wearing a miniature uniform, tiny armor, polished boots, a helmet too large for his head. The soldiers laughed and lifted him onto their shoulders. They called him Caligula, Little Boots. He was the son of Germanicus, Rome's most admired general since Julius Caesar. The legions believed the boy brought luck. Victory followed him like a shadow. Then Germanicus died. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, Rome whispered a single word: poison. What followed was not chaos, it was procedure. Accusations of treason, arrests signed and sealed, exile carried out by order, starvation described as policy, imprisonment recorded in ledgers, torture hidden behind doors and justified as necessity. One by one, members of the family disappeared. The child watched. By the time he reached adulthood, he was the only one left. Then came the summons. The reigning emperor demanded his presence on Capri, an island described by ancient historians as a sealed world where power faced no witnesses, a fortress of indulgence, a laboratory of cruelty. For years, Caligula observed. He learned how authority reshapes people, how fear replaces conscience, how silence becomes survival. A later historian would write a line that still chills readers: "There was never a better servant, nor a worse master." When the old emperor died, the survivor returned to Rome, wearing a crown. The city celebrated. They believed they were welcoming mercy. They did not know what had been perfected in private. By the third week inside the Garden of Venus, time stops behaving normally. Days no longer feel separate. Mornings bleed into evenings. Sleep comes in fragments, broken by distant footsteps, murmured orders, doors opening and closing with deliberate slowness. No one tells you the rules, and that is the first rule. People assume prisons rely on walls and chains. The garden did not. Its power came from uncertainty, from never knowing what action would trigger consequence, or whether consequence would come at all. Some days passed quietly, others ended with a name being spoken aloud, always calmly, always without explanation. An attendant would appear at the door, eyes lowered, voice steady. Prepare yourself. That was all. No one ever asked for what. Those taken were not dragged, they were escorted. That distinction mattered. Force would have created resistance. Ceremony created compliance. The door would close behind them, and the waiting would begin again. The garden was not designed for comfort, it was designed for observation. Corridors curved gently, preventing long sightlines. Rooms opened into shared courtyards where movement could be seen from multiple angles. Curtains were luxurious, but never thick enough to block sound. You were never fully alone. You were never fully watched. That ambiguity was intentional. Attendants rotated frequently, faces changed, names were never offered, conversations were brief, functional, polite. No emotional attachment was permitted on either side, because attachment creates loyalty, and loyalty creates defiance. Every detail, from lighting to meal schedules, was adjusted to keep residents slightly off balance, not suffering, just unsettled. Comfortable enough not to panic, uncertain enough not to relax. People often ask why no one resisted. That question misunderstands how control works. Resistance requires three things: information, trust, hope. The garden removed all three. No one knew how decisions were made, no one trusted anyone else, and hope eroded slowly, day by day. Attempts to connection were quietly punished. Two people seen whispering too often would be separated, not violently, just reassigned to opposite ends of the complex. The message was subtle but clear. Isolation is most effective when it looks voluntary. Soon, people stopped trying. They learned to sit quietly, to smile when spoken to avoid attention. They learned that invisibility felt like safety. Somewhere beyond the courtyards and silk-draped rooms, clerks worked in silence. They did not raise their voices, they did not shout orders, they wrote. Wax tablets were filled with observations, schedules adjusted, names marked and unmarked, no emotions recorded, just facts, behavior patterns, compliance levels, emotional responses. This was not chaos, this was governance. The emperor did not need to be present. The system ran without him. That was its brilliance and its horror. A machine does not feel guilt. Night was when the garden did its deepest damage. Lights dimmed gradually, never fully dark. Silence settled, but never completely. Somewhere, someone was always awake. Footsteps echoed unpredictably. Sometimes they passed your door, sometimes they stopped, sometimes nothing happened at all. That uncertainty trained the mind to stay alert, to anticipate, to exhaust itself. Sleep deprivation softened resistance more effectively than force ever could. By morning, people moved more slowly, thought less clearly, spoke less. That was the point. Those who came back from summons were different, not injured, not visibly harmed, just altered. They avoided eye contact, flinched at sudden sounds, spoke in shorter sentences. Some laughed at inappropriate moments, others stopped speaking entirely. No one asked them what had happened, because asking implied you might be next, and because answers, once heard, cannot be unheard. The garden trained silence as instinct. Outside the palace walls, Rome continued. Markets opened, temples filled, senators debated policy beneath marble statues of virtue and honor. Rumors circulated, of course, they always do. But rumors are easy to dismiss when acknowledging them costs everything. Officials told themselves this was necessary, that order required unpleasant measures, that stability justified discomfort. Families told themselves it was temporary, that compliance ensured safety, that asking questions would only make things worse. And so the machine ran smoothly, not because everyone was cruel, but because everyone was afraid. Inside the palace, banquets became performances. Guests reclined on cushions, surrounded by excess, food piled high, wine flowing freely, music echoing through vast halls. At moments, the emperor would rise and walk among them. He did not shout, he did not threaten, he observed. A pause here, a look there, a remark delivered with perfect calm. Humiliation did not need volume. Those targeted laughed along, faces tight, hands trembling just enough to be noticed. Everyone else watched carefully, because watching taught them where the line was, and because being seen not reacting was itself a test. The lesson was clear. Dignity was conditional. The most dangerous part of the system was not fear, it was participation. Officials signed orders because refusing would draw attention. Guards followed procedures because procedures were safer than conscience. Guests laughed because silence would stand out. Each small compromise felt survivable. Together, they built a prison no one could escape. Once you participate, even passively, speaking out becomes impossible. Doing so would expose not just the system, but your role in it. And so silence hardened into habit. But systems built on fear always develop fractures. Whispers reached the guards, not details, never details, but patterns. Names called too often, people not returning, the atmosphere shifting, darkening. Among them stood a veteran officer, disciplined, decorated, accustomed to command. He had seen cruelty before. War teaches that. What unsettled him was not violence, but arbitrariness. Mockery without purpose, power exercised for spectacle alone. At banquets, insults sharpened, public, repeated. Laughter from others felt thinner each time. Something began to calcify inside him, not anger, but resolve. The corridor beneath the palace was narrow and dim, used by servants and guards. No audience, no ceremony, routine. That is how it had to be. Power rarely expects resistance from those closest to it. A gesture, a signal, a step taken out of rhythm. Steel flashed. History pivoted in silence. What followed was confusion. Orders contradicted, doors locked and unlocked. Officials waited for instructions that never came. The machine had lost its center. Without constant reinforcement, fear fractured. People spoke, guards hesitated, clerks destroyed records, not out of mercy, but self-preservation. The garden emptied quietly. No announcements, no explanations, just absence. A new ruler faced an impossible choice: expose everything and tear Rome apart, or erase it. He chose erasure. Documents burned, witnesses compensated and dismissed, survivors encouraged to forget. History was edited, but trauma does not obey decrees. Some carried the damage in silence for decades, some never entered enclosed spaces again, some heard footsteps in their dreams until the end of their lives. Fragments survived, hidden in marginal notes, copied texts, passing references scholars would puzzle over centuries later. Enough to know, enough to warn. Because this was never just about one ruler, it was about a system that functioned because everyone played their part, because fear is efficient, because silence is contagious, because cruelty becomes invisible when dressed as order, and because no empire is immune. The Garden of Venus did not disappear. It changed names. It changed uniforms. It learned to hide better. Rome did not collapse when the Garden of Venus operated. That's the detail most people miss. The empire didn't burn. The streets didn't riot. The temples didn't empty. Rome functioned. And that's what makes this story terrifying. Because when cruelty becomes routine, it stops looking like cruelty. At first, people whispered. Then they lowered their voices. Then they stopped whispering at all. Not because the rumors stopped, but because acknowledging them required action, and action was dangerous. Roman society was built on hierarchy. Everyone answered to someone above them. Responsibility flowed upward. Guilt flowed nowhere. A father told himself, if this were truly wrong, someone higher would stop it. A senator told himself, if everyone else is silent, speaking out would only destroy my family. A guard told himself, orders are not my concern, stability is. Each excuse felt reasonable. Together, they created permission. Caligula didn't argue that his actions were just. He didn't need to. Power doesn't persuade, it redefines. When the emperor acts without consequence, behavior becomes precedent, precedent becomes policy, policy becomes culture. What shocked Rome in year 1 became background noise by year 4. The unimaginable became familiar, and familiar things stopped provoking outrage. Roman elites obsessed over appearance. Honor was displayed, not practiced. Public rituals continued, speeches about virtue, statues celebrating restraint, laws reinforcing morality. All of it hollow. Inside private halls, behavior contradicted every public value, but contradiction is easy to tolerate when it benefits you. Rome had always used spectacle to manage emotion. Gladiatorial games, executions, parades. Violence, ritualized and distant, kept the population focused outward. While attention stayed on the arena, quieter horrors went unnoticed. People talked about performances. They didn't talk about what happened behind closed doors. Most of what we know survived by accident. Official records were destroyed, archives purged. What remained were fragments, lines written decades later by historians who were careful with their words. Not because they lacked courage, because they lived under systems that remembered. Tacitus writes with restraint. Suetonius hints, then moves on. Cassius Dio circles truths without naming them. They weren't lying, they were surviving. The survivors returned to lives that no longer fit them. They had no vocabulary for what they'd endured. Roman culture had words for bravery, honor, shame, but none for psychological fracture. Pain without language becomes isolation. Isolation becomes silence. Silence becomes inheritance. Trauma cast quietly through generations, embedded in behavior rather than stories. Avoidance, fear of authority, distrust of institutions, symptoms without explanation. History loves simple villains. It's comforting to believe cruelty comes from monsters, but Caligula didn't act alone. He relied on clerks, guards, senators, citizens who complied. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as designed. Blaming one ruler lets everyone else escape responsibility. That's the real danger. Because warning requires confession, and confession threatens legacy. Rome chose continuity over truth, so did every empire after it. Different century, different uniforms, same mechanisms. Isolation, bureaucracy, silence. Fear disguised as order. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And systems like the Garden of Venus don't announce themselves, they call themselves necessary. Caligula didn't fall because Rome rejected cruelty. He fell because power humiliated the wrong person. That's it. No uprising, no moral awakening, no justice, just chance. And chance is not a safeguard. Because systems don't stop on their own. They stop when people refuse to normalize what feels wrong, when silence becomes unbearable, when someone decides that survival without dignity isn't survival at all. The Garden of Venus didn't vanish. It learned, it adapted, and every time people choose silence over discomfort, it comes back, quietly, efficiently, legally. History doesn't warn us loudly, it whispers. And the question isn't whether we'll hear it, it's whether we'll pretend we didn't. The most dangerous systems don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with banners or uniforms or speeches about control. They arrive quietly, professionally, with paperwork. That's the real lesson of the Garden of Venus. Not what happened inside its walls, but how easily the world outside accepted that those walls needed to exist at all. Every generation believes it is immune. We study history and tell ourselves, we would have spoken up, we would have refused, we would have seen the warning signs. But the people of Rome believed that too. They didn't think of themselves as villains, they thought of themselves as practical. Modern cruelty rarely looks like cruelty. It looks like policy, procedure, national interest, stability, security. It speaks the language of necessity, just like Rome did. No one says, this will destroy people. They say, this is regrettable but unavoidable. That sentence has justified more harm than any tyrant ever could alone. Caligula's cruelty shocked people because it felt personal. But the Garden of Venus was worse because it functioned without emotion. No screaming, no rage, no chaos, just forms being filled out, schedules being followed, orders being passed down. That's why bureaucracy survives every regime change. It doesn't care who sits at the top, it just keeps running. Most people don't choose evil, they choose distance. They say, I'm not involved, I don't know enough, someone else will handle it. Distance numbs responsibility, and once responsibility is numb, almost anything becomes tolerable. Rome's most powerful men knew what was happening. They said nothing. The one who acted wasn't the most educated or the most influential. He was the one who felt the humiliation directly, daily, publicly, personally. That's uncomfortable truth number one. Systems don't fall because they're immoral. They fall because they become inconvenient. Morality alone rarely stops machinery. Pain does. As long as harm feels distant, people adapt. As long as the system targets someone else, silence feels safe. That's how cruelty scales, not all at once, piece by piece, person by person, until one day there is no someone else left. The greatest lie isn't, this isn't happening, it's, you can't change it. Rome believed that lie, so did every empire that followed, and believing it is the final step in becoming part of the machine. The Garden of Venus left almost no physical trace, no intact walls, no preserved rooms, no official acknowledgement, just fragments, and fragments are enough, because patterns repeat even when details change. Not, what would you have done back then? That's easy. The real question is, what are you looking away from right now because it feels safer not to see it? The machine that destroyed those lives didn't need monsters. It needed quiet people, polite people, reasonable people. People who told themselves this wasn't their responsibility, and as long as people keep doing that, the machine will never die. History doesn't repeat itself loudly. It waits, it watches, and when the conditions are right, it begins again, with softer words, cleaner paperwork, and fewer people willing to speak. This is Hidden Secret Tales. We don't tell these stories to shock you. We tell them so you can recognize the machine before it asks you to stay quiet. Because the past isn't dead, it's patient, and it's always waiting for silence.